Hello, Oki, bonjour. Thank you for joining us today for a conversation with JessicaKaruhanga and Nehal El-Hadi. My name is Cassandra Paul, and I am the Exhibitions and Programs Coordinator with the Illingworth Kerr Gallery at AU Arts. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge the land I am currently broadcasting from and where I call home. I am a settler Canadian with roots in Scotland, England, and Northwestern Europe. My ancestors most likely migrated to Canada in the 1800s through Newfoundland and Labrador, home of the Inuit, Innu, and Mi'kmaq, eventually settling in Mohkinstsis, Calgary. AU Arts and the IKG similarly rest on the traditional territories of the Sarcee, Tsuut'ina First Nation, the Iahe Nakota First Nations, including the Wesley, Chiniki, and Bearspaw First Nations, the Niitsitapi Blackfoot Confederacy, comprised of the nations the Blackfoot Siksika, the Pagan Piikani, the Kainai Blood Tribe, and Southern Alberta and Treaty 7 are also home to the peoples of Métis Region 3. I would also like to acknowledge where both our speakers, Jessica and Nehal, are located. Takaranto is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse nations, Inuit and Métis people. This week is also Veterans Week, as we observe Remembrance Day on November 11th and Aboriginal Veterans Day today. I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the many contributions and sacrifices of First Nation, Métis, and Inuit people in protecting and serving so-called Canada. It's important to recognize this day in addition to Remembrance Day, because Indigenous veterans were not allowed to share a toast in honor of lost comrades in a Royal Canadian Legion until 1951, and only still if the province allowed it. And it wasn't until the mid-1990s that Indigenous veterans and their families were allowed to lay wreaths at the National War Memorial in Ottawa on Remembrance Day. Acknowledging Indigenous veterans' roles in the protection and peacekeeping of Canada will help all citizens understand what true reconciliation means to this country as a whole. We must never forget the sacrifices and accomplishments of these veterans, especially as we move forward in our journey of healing, reconciliation, and a renewed relationship between Canada and Indigenous peoples. So thank you again for joining us today for a conversation between JessicaKaruhanga and Nehal El-Hadi. This presentation is supported by the Ellen and Daryl Fridhandler Lecture on Non-Western Visual Arts Practice and TD Insurance. Please note there is a Q&A tab on the side, and we will be moderating questions at the end of this discussion. So I will now introduce our two speakers. JessicaKaruhanga is a first-generation Canadian artist of British-Ugandan heritage whose work addresses issues of cultural politics of identity and Black diasporic concerns through lens-based technologies, writing, drawing, and performances. Through her practice, she explores individual and collective concerns of Black subjectivity, illness, rage, grief, desire, and longing within the context of Black embodiment. She is the 2020-2021 recipient of Concordia University's Spoken Web Artist Curator in Residence Fellowship. Karuhanga has also presented her work at Summerworks Lab, the Bentway, Nuit Blanche, On-Site Gallery, and Goldsmiths University. She is currently exhibiting at the Robert McLaughlin Gallery, Tangled Disability and Art and Museum, London. Karuhanga's writing has been published by C Magazine, Black Flash, Susan Hobbs Gallery, and Foundry Darling. She has been featured in AGO's Artist Spotlight, ID, Dazed, Visual Aids, Border Crossings, Exclaim, Toronto Star, CBC Arts, Essay, Filthy Dreams, Globe and Mail, and Canadian Art. She earned her BFA from Western University and MFA from University of Victoria. She lives and works in Toronto, Canada, where she is a part-time lecturer at Ryerson University. Nehal El-Hadi is a writer, researcher, and editor whose work explores the intersections between the body, place, and technology. Nehal completed her PhD in planning at the University of Toronto, where she examined the relationships between user-generated content and everyday public urban life. As a scholar, her hybrid digital material research methods are informed by her training and experience as a science and environmental journalist. Her writing has appeared in academic journals, general scholarship publications, literary magazines, anthologies, and edited collections. She is currently the Science and Technology Editor at The Conversation Canada and Editor-in-Chief of Studio Magazine. So welcome to both our speakers, and thank you for joining us.
Okay, so I wanted to begin by foregrounding a video work while speaking in the background. So this project is titled No Other Findings, and it's a series of calibration scans of my body produced by a magnetic resonance imaging machine, or an MRI. These scans track the development of my chronic illness. So they contain deeply information about my internal world, but also reveal little to those who aren't familiar with how to read the imaging or the body in this way. The pacing is meant to move to a rhythm one might make while breathing, meditatively, or in my case, while remaining still to calm myself while inside the machine. Considering the disposition and deferral of all Black life, and all the experiences that are unknown to us as Black subjects, this video, which to me is more of a sketch or diary entry, asks what it might mean to consider breath, proximity, and touch. So I wanted to begin with something recent that speaks to embodiment maybe, and then expand outward into the rooms, walls, and worlds I inhabit. So the next video I want to discuss is body and soul. So if no other findings is about my internal world, Body and Soul explores the fixation and fissures of surface and skin that more readily or differently speaks to the medicalized body. I think it's the white wall within the video maybe that again is projected onto the white walls of the institution that gives way to this meaning. The flesh here becomes a synecdoche for race as a sign of social difference. The cartography of the body invites a consideration of Blackness and breath and stillness and subjectivity. The title is a reference to the jazz standard made popular by Billie Holiday, and on some level also speaks to Cartesian subjectivity. So the next work I'm going to speak about is a two-channel video installation titled Being Who You Are, There Is No Other. And this work explores themes of wilderness and wildness through the vestiges of two Black subjects. So I'm going to play a little excerpt for you with the sound, and then after maybe about 30 seconds to a minute, I'll describe it a bit more for you, or my intentions. Through this piece, I wanted to explore what Catherine McKittrick has referred to as the absent presence of blackness, or what Nebeze Philip has referred to as the black hole in the construct of the Canadian. Personally, I grew up back and forth between the rocky terrain of the boreal forests and the flatness of southwestern Ontario, specifically the industrial border town of Sarnia, Ontario. It was impossible growing up to articulate the erasure and suffocation as a Black subject in this terrain. Recently, I saw a TikTok video of a young Black man frolicking in the field, and the caption or text in kind of overlaying the image was this kind of exclamation of, "Have you ever tried frolicking? I highly recommend it." And I feel that this perfectly humoristically, but in truth and jest, in all seriousness, speaks to things unknown to Black folks. So what's interesting about this video piece is people of all backgrounds within mixed company love this project and are constantly commenting on its beauty and how it makes them want to move, you know, as if we're all Florine Maria frolicking in the Swiss Alps. And to be honest, that probably was a subconscious influence, but yeah, I just want to leave you with that thought maybe while witnessing this. So the next project I want to talk about is a performance and installation titled Through a Brass Channel. And if you click on the video link on the website, like if you scroll down, and the one that says All Our Days of Furl of Breath, you can play that. You should be able to click on it. If not, like sharing this, yes, there we are. Okay, so in my practice, I attempt to sculpt images through rhythm and ritual, poetry, and movement. There's a sense of witnessing private or sanctified rituals or symbolic invocations through these everyday objects, whether that be screens, monitors, phones, or headphones. In specifically my performance work, I'm often repeating movements as a gesture of insistence directed towards permanence. So I'm often trying to repeat these gestures and push them towards the audience's gaze. And in doing that, I want to hold your attention so that you are there present with the subjects that are activating these objects, with the figure, with these moments, these movements, so that you're there when someone is making symbols with salt on the floor. You're there when they sway to the same tune that you might be listening to. You're alone together in this sort of secret connection. There is slowness, there is stillness. I am both the subject and witness as I'm gazed upon and gazing back. And I'd like to believe that my videos, whether they are performances for the camera or documentation of performances that have a kind of cinematographic quality to them, or capturing the details, that they are in a reference to a legacy of performance and lens-based histories. So this project was presented at Justina M. Barnaky Gallery, which is at part of the larger University of Arts, I was going to say presentation center, part of UTAC, which is at University of Toronto, and it's called Through a Brass Channel. And the idea being that these objects that meant something to each performer or activator would be a conduit or channel or point of connection between us. And we would use these materials as ready-mades. So we began very restrained at the beginning, but towards the end, quite literally everything became a prop within the installation. So someone brought salt, someone brought hair. You can see it looks like a nest or a hat resting on my head. And this project touched on themes of nostalgia or aspirational futures. So I'm going to share with you an audio clip from one of the sound works that was part of this installation. I think there was about 5 separate works. There was a sculpture, there was us performing, a couple videos. So this is a sound piece called All of Me. We can't hear the sound. I think maybe you turned it off when you were trying to help me with the last video. No.
Yeah, sorry, Jessica, I can hear it, but if no one else can hear it.
Yeah. Okay, that's fine. We can share that last video then, and then, sorry about that. I can share links for people to listen to on their own time. So yes, if we can go to the last slide, that would be great. Okay. So I wanted to kind of start with the present and then move kind of backwards in time. So this, I wanted to go back specifically to a decade ago when I was in grad school and kind of arrived at this project, which I see as a kind of instigator or the ignition behind a lot of these projects. And this is a piece called Gold Ankle Bone Cups. So this piece began as a sculpture. When I arrived in Victoria, within the first 2 weeks, we were asked, kind of in the way that a suggestive donation operates, we were compelled to create a new work or bring a work we already had made for a group show that would kind of introduce us in our practices. When I moved to Victoria, I brought nothing with me but a suitcase, and I was really just waiting for my OSAP check to get deposited. So anyway, I was in a position where I had very little resources or funds to go towards creating any work, especially in such a short timeline. So what I ended up doing was scavenging these materials from the junkyard that was in the center courtyard of campus and made this kind of ramshackle stage. And I just experimented making recordings of myself, audio recordings, dancing on the platform, improvising various rhythms as if I was a human drumstick. And that audio in its initial iteration or presentation would play in a boombox that would sit on the stage, plugged into the wall, and it would sort of suggest that visitors to the gallery could step on the stage and dance to the music or dance with the kind of ghost or spectral trace of an event that sort of happened on there. I was really playing around with the idea of refuse and ephemera and props that are like kind of key words or features and kind of performative gestures. So eventually this piece would become a prop for a performance for the camera that became this video, which just had some minor editing where I kind of smudged. I think I used Final Cut Pro, or not Final Cut Pro, Photoshop to kind of make the edges kind of blurred a little bit. So in its final iteration, it looks like you're kind of looking through a peephole or a hole in the ground and kind of gazing in on this kind of private gesture. And again, you only see the bottoms of the legs, the calves, and the ankles, and kind of racial markers, but not really much else is given away. And this is probably one of my first performances, I guess you could say, performances with a camera that ever became a kind of complete work. And yeah, it's just remains one of my favorite video works. And it's really just the precursor to a lot of the projects I was working on now. And the last piece that I wanted to share, but I won't be able to because the audio is not working, is a research project that's currently still being developed, is almost in finalization, but it's a project called You Feel Me. It's also an installation and performance that is kind of concurrently hosted by Tangled Disability in Art in downtown Toronto and the Robert McLaughlin Gallery in Oshawa. And basically it's a 38-minute score that I co-composed with a friend of mine who's a producer, who mixed and mastered it for me. And it's kind of a piece that speaks to sort of solitude and isolation and the unknowability in relation to Blackness and what we do when we can't commune to kind of cope with the deferral of Black life. So that's the audio piece. There's also a sculptural element, and currently I'm developing a choreo that will move to the music, so it becomes kind of a dance performance score. So it will be a film that's the same length as the audio that kind of takes you on this journey of it's a narrative, but it's more an emotional kind of abstract narrative. So that's still in the works. I will share those links for you, so on your own time you can spend time with the music, which is kind of ideal actually. But yeah, I just wanted to share a little glimpse before Nehal and I start our conversation. So thank you.
Great, thank you, Jessica. And then I will just send you both live here.
Perfect.
Okay, so Jessica and Nehal, you're both live now.
Wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me today. It's always a great privilege to be able to talk to you, Jessica, about your work, especially in a setting like this where we have the time to explore it a bit more in depth. Obviously, I've been following and I've known your work for a number of years now. We've collaborated together. You know, we've discussed your projects and before. And one of the things that has always struck me in the way that you approach what you make is the significance of the body, often your body. Most of the times it's your body as a stand-in for other bodies. And I'd like to hear a little bit more from you about that.
Mm-hmm.
Why is that so important to your practice?
So I knew when I was in school, I feel like a lot of this is interesting. This came up now that I'm mentoring students who are exploring all various forms of identity and embodiment. Sometimes we get stuck in this space of like representation. And I think intuitively, when I started making work or being interested in taking things maybe away from the canvas or sculptural processes to using my body, it made sense. It felt like the only ethical or right place to start was with myself before I had any right or knew how to care for or hold space or keep other bodies safe, other subjects safe that I would later come to invite into my works. Before I had any sense of that, I needed to kind of subject my body to a lot of vulnerability and sometimes even physical pain and endurance. So there's that felt very important as an initial kind of like impulse before I could even begin to talk about Blackness on a grander sort of scale was to just start with myself, and not as a representation of all peoples, which I could never be, but I can draw analogies to my own experience.
I find that really, really intriguing, and especially the ways in which, you know, it's not just that you use your own body, but you also zoom in and zoom out of it, right? Like you go in deep and then you extend to beyond it. And looking at the examples that you've shown us, which are representative kind of the scope of your work, that was a real observation for me to make. And I'll probably ask you about it again at some point later on in this conversation. I also was curious about what you want your audience to know. I mean, you talked about the unknowability and how work sometimes can be opaque, but what is it that you want your audience to understand before they witness or participate or engage with your work?
I think it's about, I think about this a lot because I make art that's very much for a specific audience, and specific works might get even more. It's not just about site specificity, which has its own kind of historical context, but even like body specific, like kind of like location, or like it can be the intersection of disability and Blackness as an example that I touched at in the very beginning. But I feel like it's about knowing your place, or just being honest about where these connections begin or end. Like I'm always trying to meet people where they're at when they encounter the thing, and it's okay. Like I remember oddly the piece Being Who You Are, There Is No Other is one of my most accessible pieces, but I don't want that to ever be conflated with it being easy to read or easy to understand or easy to like recognize. Like and I love that different audiences encounter it and get something out of it. Like Joe, like, you know, coming from a working class blue collar kind of context that I grew up in, you know, I feel like anyone could read it there, or you could read the theory and the texts, the essays that I like am also thinking about, and maybe you get something else out of it. But I also think there's just an embodied knowing kind of reaction that is just as intelligent as having known like cultural theory, for example. Like to me, I'm never really trying to be that esoteric, but at the same time, it's not even that about code switching per se. I just think that there's like always different channels of entry, even if you're watching a film with someone, or there's different things that you're each going to pick up on or take out of it. So to me, just come as you are, and yeah, just like that's kind of where I'm at when it comes to like mixed audiences engaging with my work. But there's definitely works that I've done where I've either stopped performing them or I've transformed them or changed them, because particularly works that have to do with Black pain, I'd say more so than anything else, where there's a point where as I get more recognition, the audience becomes more and more expansive and the proximity to whiteness greater, that particularly the one piece that I did that had to do with grief and mourning, it just felt wrong to continue to share that work, because it's like, even when I'm performing, I like to think of my performances more as enactments, even if they are on display. Like, I think that's why I keep talking about private versus public and ritual, because it really is about presenting or sharing these kind of sanctified spaces, even if you don't fully have access. So yeah, it's a thin line, but I'm always trying to straddle between those, between like the expectation and boundaries and all of that.
Okay. How do you come up with the concepts, the ideas? Like, how does a work start to take form for you?
For me, well, I guess I sometimes I think this comes up also when I'm talking to my friends who are also artists or creatives. I feel like there was a moment for me when I was going to art school. I had an idea of what I thought I was going to be as an artist, or what being an artist meant. And then, you study this kind of art history, and it was like the moment I realized that quite literally anything can be material, the whole world opened up for me. And it is partly semantics and semiotics, but even, someone like Marcel Duchamp, like, has particular kind of historical, symbolic, like, a meaning. And then, there's someone like David Hammons, who the way that he uses symbols, invokes symbols of Blackness or his specific community, that like made me think, okay, like this can be the materiality, like to really think very intentionally about the materials and symbols I sort of use. So I think I'm always moving from that place. Like, I have a performance called Ground and Cover Me, where all I'm doing is just wearing headphones and sweatpants and a shirt, and I'm just improvising movements in a hallway, and just kind of tracing the contours, like with my hands and my limbs, of this hallway at an art school, OCAD. And it was a student that commissioned me to do this performance for her kind of thesis curatorial research. And I kind of and it was something, engaging with the site and the kind of colonial histories of this location. And so I just kind of improvised this piece, but really I was thinking about when I encounter people on the streets or the subway and they have their headphones on, people have their own kind of individual swagger, the way that they're kind of in their own isolated world while still together with everyone else in the world. Like, we're alone together, we're isolated together. So for me, the headphones became this kind of tool that I could use, incorporate into a performance that would act as a partition and also like a safety net, a boundary between me and an audience. So like, if you were close enough to my body physically, you could hear traces of whatever it is I was listening to that would maybe indicate what I'm moving to or what my movements are about, because otherwise it looks a bit weird in the space. But so sometimes it comes from something like that. With being who you are, there is no other. It's such anyone that lives in Scarborough or even lives in this geographic area of Canada, of Ontario, would recognize kind of or be familiar with the kind of like imagery in the background. And then just to kind of be performing these kind of movements that are read as kind of like bohemian and like carefree is a very intentional kind of like gesture, because it's not familiar, or you start to peel back those kind of layers. So really it comes from a very intuitive level, but I'm just like, what are the things that matter to me and how can I use that, incorporate that into my gestures?
That's pretty cool. I'm also really intrigued by how you approach site, like space and site and location. My own background's in geography, and so I have a particular relationship to the study and the analysis and research of space and the meanings that we ascribe to it. And I'm really intrigued by the way in which you pull out meanings from particular locations. And I wonder what informs those choices for you.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that I'm still sort of figuring out. But it definitely even informs how I move, or the maybe, like, I use the term choreography, but how I think already in an everyday level, when I'm not like consciously making an artwork, how I move in a space or suss a space out is totally contingent on my body politic and embodiments, and how you go through these kind of cultural shifts depending on the location. So I had this performance I conceived once where it's a piece that I no longer perform, that is about Black grief, and it's called A Still Cling to Fading Blossoms. And in that piece, I eat daisy flowers and while singing an elegy, and it obstructs my breathing, and the lyrics are not decipherable, but as I pull the daisies out and take the petals off, the message becomes clearer. And obviously daisies, you have that love me so, love me not, but I wanted to make that about Black life, like the love and care for like Black life as like being more than this like performative, symbolic thing caught up in just like image and the consumption of those images. So with that piece, I was initially thinking of it as kind of like a procession, or thinking of processions, funeral processions, as like, could that become like choreographed in the sort of movement? And it was performed in an outdoor rural space initially. And this predates Being Who You Are, There Is No Other. But then I was invited to perform it as part of this series of programming at a subway station in Toronto, in Greektown. And dislocating that project was really interesting, because here I was rehearsing for this performance, and then being this Black person eating flowers outside a subway station, like rehearsing for this piece is like people encountering that were like concerned, but in a way where concern is also maybe about like surveilling and like watching and witnessing, and those kind of blurred kind of lines. So geography for me, or sight, is also about, exploring kind of safety, or how I change my movements, how I change my voice, how I dress, all these kinds of like things come up for that. And then also what informs me, like sometimes it's in the voice, like people are always commenting or wondering where I'm from. And I think it's just, my voice is like a melange of like my parents' accents growing up on the border of America and Canada. It's like a pseudo-American accent or something. So I think it comes up in all these different ways. Oh, your mic is off.
Thank you. This is the bane of my existence right now. I was saying that it was really interesting to see the ways in which you approach space, and I'd love to have, a couple more hours to talk about your own personal geographies and the ways that they've shaped, like how where you've been influences what you make. But that would be a whole other topic of conversation. And I have a lot of questions that I want to ask you now too. You're not just an artist, you're also a writer and a curator. And I'm very interested in those roles that you take and how they relate to your artwork. And if we could start by like curation as an artist, what made you interested in curation, and what kind of projects do you take on?
Right. My interest in curation straight up was just not like, I would grow, when I was in school, I was sort of isolated, and I wasn't as familiar with a lot of the sort of Black scholars or academics in Toronto or within Canada. I was in art school. All of this stuff that sort of came at sideways, whether it's like I was reading like Stuart Hall or whatever it was. But I remember thinking about so, you know, I'd come across like Kelly Jones, Thelma Golden, and then through friends of mine that were being curated here, like Pamela Edmonds, Andrea Fatona. So, oh my gosh, who am I forgetting? There's so many amazing Black curators who I would later sort of become familiar with and their practices. But it's still, I guess my impulse as a young person was not really, everything I was seeing curated, everything I was seeing at galleries, museums was just, if they did feature people of color, they were often curated by white folks who had there was a limitation. There were talk about the art in very particular ways, like outside of it. And so it was through, and that still is like such a thing that dominates sort of conversation. I think it's very in right now to, you know, draw a kind of circle and invite people into the institution, but there still isn't kind of divesting of sort of power. So you have, it's like significant when you know, the AGO, you have people like Wanda Nanabush and Julie Crooks who have these like significant positions now. But when I was like in my undergrad, I didn't see that, like those levels of like roles or power. So it's still very new and recent. So I think it was more out of that being like, if I don't see it, like if the door is not open for me, then I'm going to climb in through a window. So it was really out of this necessity being like, no one talks about me or gets what I'm doing, or like no one's writing about, like I feel like I have something valid and valuable to contribute. Maybe not to a canon, because my precedents aren't just in the canon, you know. The hip hop music I listen to, my aunties are just as relevant as like canonical historical things that I also enjoy reading or like encountering. So it was about an absence, but it's not that it didn't exist. Maybe I couldn't see or didn't have access to it, but also that those roles are still very like new. Those like roles of like power. So yeah, I think that's why I wanted to experiment with curation, but also I feel like it was a way of like using, as I gain more recognition power, a way of like bringing people up with me, putting people on to, like, I always feel like it's important never to forget where you come from. Like I constantly joke that, you know, you can take the gal out of like Sarnia, but you can't take the Sarnia out of the girl. Like I'm very much a Black person of a particular, like Toronto isn't my context, it's where I'm situated right now, but that isn't like my like history, you know, and that definitely informs and shapes how I like move through the world. So it definitely, the desire to curate comes from that. And it's just an extension of my practice, really. Like, how do I assemble or arrange or collaborate with these other ways of moving and being in the world? Like, how can I make these connections or draw these relationships that maybe other people aren't seeing? Because that's what I'm always interested in when I see other curators' work or other artists' work. It's the same type of thing, the relationships that they're drawing between objects and material and space. And then with writing, I mean, my writing is always very kind of like lyrical or poetic. It doesn't matter if it's an essay, a review, or like an exhibition essay. It's always like, there's always a style to it. I'm by no means an art critic, although I'll like complain about art criticism till the end of the day, but I don't have a leg to stand on. It's not like I'm doing a better job at it. So yeah, that's kind of, I do see them as extensions of my art practice. Like I've always said that I identify as an artist and the message determines the medium. So sometimes the medium for me is writing a text, sometimes it's curating, sometimes it's a video, sometimes it's a performance, sometimes it's a sculpture or a painting. Like I'm not attached to these labels, and I may entirely give up. Like I can count on one hand how many performances I've done, and yet I'm like labeled a performance artist. So I don't mind that. But I'm just not attached to these like labels. But artist seems the most simple thing. So then I can write, and then because if I identified as a writer, then, you know, people that are really attached to being a writer get in their feelings about that. And I just think that's kind of funny, or people that are really attached to these roles. Like, to me, I just like to meander to wherever feels right in a moment.
Well, I saw what you did with Ineffable Blazes as an extension of your practice for sure, rather than you trying to be a curator, you know,
Yes.
that you put on with like a mix of artists who are younger and lesser known, but also well known and more established. So there are a couple of rising stars, a couple of unknowns, and that was really interesting to me, because it wasn't just a show that you did, you had programming around it, and there was a very deliberate approach to putting it together that seemed not at all different from what you did or how you approached your work. And it's interesting that you say that people see you as a performance artist, because I thought, like, in this current day and age, that what the hell is a genre anyway? Like, what's a restriction? So I like the idea of being like, all right, this is what I want to do, and this is the medium that fits it the most. But having said that, you know, not a lot of artists have curatorial experiences, and an artist-curator relationship is so fascinating.
Yeah.
It's about a lot of, like, there's a lot in terms of control and power, but they shift very quickly and very rapidly. Ultimately, you know, it's an institution or a curator or a market that kind of wins out. So I'm interested in your observations on that relationship, having done both.
Yeah, I think that relationship is very important. I think it's important, just as in any relationship dynamic in general, to have, if you're going to be successful at it, in a way where everyone feels held or respected, although there will always be ego shit and glitch, like that stuff can come up invariably, but it's to have very clear kind of boundaries and clear like communication, especially like just to be honest about the power dynamic. So when I curated that exhibition, I very much positioned myself as an artist curator, where the exhibition space is like the medium, you know, like that's the channel, that's the frame, the canvas or whatever. And I was, I guess, technically a curator in residence. So I had no, it was like a contract. Like I got a grant that this artist run center, it was like, you can host this space. And that was kind of the in-kind donation they gave to me. Like you can have the thing in this space. And so, but the rest of it was a grant that I wrote. So that went towards, you know, hiring the art handlers, paying the artist fees, the publication, working on all these kind of things. So it was like a kind of a very quick lesson in production, project management, curator. And I couldn't possibly also be an artist in that role, or like not an artist the way that the other artists were. But also, you know, I was using this gallery as a tool, but like if the gallery was late, they held the money. So if they were late making payments, if they were messing anything up, I was like the conduit or the kind of representative, even though I didn't actually work for the gallery. So sometimes you have stuff like that kind of goes on, the like institutional messiness. So that was very frustrating or difficult for me to like figure out how to kind of navigate, and this is where I'm very much an artist. I just want to have fun and play and be an artist or creator. Like I resented at the time, but now I think I'm more mature or older, like have more experience. I know how to navigate these things better. But at the time I resented how I representationally had power, but didn't really have power. And yeah, like when you're just like a kind of curator in residence, you're not on the payroll. You are kind of at the mercy of all these other figures before the cloak and behind the cloak, you know? And so there's a lot, and I think it changes depending on the machine that's behind you and the operational budget and power they have. Like there's all these like layers, right? So there's that stuff. Pardon?
Has that changed how you receive curation now, I guess?
Yes, absolutely. I really want it to be like a conversation or feel kind of collaborative, you know, because you are in a way like a host, whether that's an Airbnb you're hosting at or it's your own home. Like metaphorically, of course, I'm speaking. I do feel like, yeah, there is like responsibility. You want accountability. You want someone to account for and account to, and that's what I mean. I think when I say the communication has to be transparent, you have to know where everything's sort of at. You need to know who the manager is. You need to know you need to know what all these rules sort of are, what the expectations are. Are you making a commission? Are you being asked to make a new work, which is a commission, or are you asking to show a work that already exists? Can they support or facilitate that? So yeah, just not to take a bite off bigger than you can chew, and to be realistic about expectations or what you can and can't do with a certain budget, with a certain space. Allow things to breathe as well. You don't need to, I think there's a temptation to like muddy things or fill up space, or like when a kid wants to use every single paint color and it becomes that like baby shit color. That's always a metaphor I use. I feel like a lot of artists and curators, when they're starting, have an impulse to do that. And it's like, restraint is okay. Minimalism is okay. You don't have to do it all. You can set the bar a little lower, because if you're going to commit to this path or career for life, you can always grow and expand, and like it can be as rich even if it's a small thing. You can curate a vitrine and it can still be meaningful.
I see what you did there.
Yeah.
This went by so quick, and I'm kind of like a little bit whiplashed, but I think we're done with our like portion of this, and we're going to open it up to Q&As right now.
Yes.
And I think Cassandra's back to handle that. Thank you so much, Jessica.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you both. That was really interesting, and I wish we had more time to continue this conversation. So there's a few questions kind of trickling in, and we do have some questions from some of the classes that are watching. So I'll read these out and see how many we can get through. So the first one is, how did you transition from being a student to having an independent, sustainable art practice? And are there some key moments you can share on that journey?
Oh, that's an awesome question. The transition was very hard, actually. I think what happens is, so I was in school, I'm going to try and keep this brief. I was in school straight from like preschool, like daycare to kindergarten, nonstop until grad school. So from when I was 3 to 25. So there's something about being within the institution that, even though it can be terrible at times, there is a certain security kind of blanket or way for moving through the world. Like even in your body, fall Virgo season is a very particular like vibe. And I feel as though, although there are aspects of going to school that were very alienating and awful as a Black and disabled person navigating the system and trying to make art that people understood and recognized and took seriously and respected. I had profs that were incredible and supportive. I also had profs that diminished what I was doing because they didn't understand the like symbols and things. I think it's important to be honest about those negative things as well. And I think it's a lesson. Honestly, art school really prepared me for the world, and that I feel like I didn't realize how like critiques or criticism and stuff like that is part of academia and definitely part of art school, how it prepares even for like conflict or conversation in everyday like life. So those were great aspects. But when I was first done, I graduated into a recession. I guess when I finished my master's is 2012, so it was a few years into the recession. Like it actually started when I was finishing my undergrad. And trying to find any type of work was hard. In a context like Toronto, nepotism and connections, it matters. You need to have the skill sets and the credentials, the degrees, but it also helps to know people. I won't say it all comes down to nepotism, but certainly, let's see, I graduated in 2012. I didn't have my first teaching job until 2016. Up until that point, I was working as a server at a Latin discotheque, a barista, and then freelance art gigs that would come up. And a lot of those gigs were performance works because I graduated and had like no money, no job. I moved back in with my dad, and who's like an African parent. So like there's no studio that I would be able to have. So that's when my practice actually became fully about writing and video and performance. It was pretty much like space, not having resources, not having money. Like, okay, I do have a camera, like a video camera, like a mini DV. I have myself, like, to like really dive deep into that, to work out that stuff. So I'd say you'll still find the channels or find the way to kind of create. Maybe it's on TikTok, maybe it's like through writing exercises, maybe like, and it doesn't have to be documented, and it doesn't have to be seen or edited or recorded for it to have legibility or legitimacy. Like, I think a lot of the most meaningful gestures I have isn't stuff that is even on my like website. You know, it's not stuff that necessarily has an audience. And try and maintain those connections you have while you're in school, like the friendships you have, and like give each other feedback on things. Even if it's like a little bit of time you can carve out. I always love this story that I'll end on, where Angela Davis is recalling driving into the city to the publishing house that Toni Morrison edited with her biography. And she was talking about Toni being a parent and in the car and like writing notes on like napkins in the car. I don't even know where I read this, or heard this, but she's talking about this, and that really moved me because I love Toni Morrison, but also she stresses me out. But she was talking about like, even if literally all you have is like a proverbial metaphorical like napkin, to like find a way. Because I will say it was very hard for me, not having any type of trust or savings, or like OSAP. I just have OSAP throughout all of my school, which is like the National Student Loan for Ontario. So it was very difficult. But I would say like within the first 2 years, you know, I started getting more art gigs. I got my first art grant 3 years out of school. In Ontario, I think there's a rule that you have to wait, or there used to be that you had to wait 2 years until you could apply for grants. So the system also makes it difficult for you if you can't self-fund your own practice. And also do art trades with your friends. So if you have a friend that has a nice camera, if you have another friend that has nice like sound equipment, like collaborate with each other, do favors for one another, and then, you know, like make your own production team or something. Like, you just gotta keep hustling. But that's how it was for me. It was very, very hard, but it worked out. It's like working out finally now, like 10 years later.
Thanks, Jessica. I love that question because I think it's different for everyone, but it's the same in that it's hard. So yeah, keep going, you'll get there. Another question is, what is your advice for visual minority artists that encounter labels, pressure of expectations, and pushback due to their appearance? How would you recommend they might stay true to what they want to express in their sense of self?
Yeah, I feel like you're gonna come across people that just don't get it. So whether as a Black artist, it'd be like non-Black artists. So even if they're POCs, I think there's gonna be stuff that they miss, because we're not all the same. As an Indigenous artist, it'd be non-Indigenous folk that aren't good. There's gonna be limits to how people can and cannot show up for you in a supporting, like mentoring type of aspect. So it's not about lowering your expectations, but just have an honest conversation with you about that, but also not to romanticize mentorship so much. Like, know that I am a true believer that you as the mentee always have the power, and you choose where and how those relationships begin and end. Like I think it's important that you try and initiate those conversations. Like, don't let someone, when the relationship or dynamic becomes too paternalistic, you're heading into tricky territory there that, for me, in my experience, never feels safe, or it's never healthy. So just like know that like a good kind of teacher and mentor is treating you like it's an exchange, and they're bringing their wisdom or knowledge to the relationship dynamic. And I'd say the same with any type of relationship where you're coming from different
positionalities, whether it's age, power, gender, like all these things that are also power dynamics, or experience dynamics. Yeah, just to like remember it's an exchange and like check in with yourself about whether it feels safe. If you have any type of like inkling about something, you know, listen to that. And yeah, like it's very easy or tempting to get caught up in representation being the only means, but representation is not everything and it has its limits. And often it's used as a device or strategy by, I don't know, Big Brother, or like it's often used to like distract us or to keep us like happy or satisfied. It's like often used as like Kool-Aid, and like that's not the only way or only means. Keep visiting artwork, seeing artists, and like people are doing interesting things in these rural or regional towns. Like if you're not seeing what you want to see, make it happen. Like Lufer Kanadu started public parking, their own kind of digital virtual website for art publishing, and I was one of the first people that he interviewed for that, and it's like exploded since. And so like that to me is incredible. You have like this African Canadian in you know, the middle of Canada that's like, you know, I'm gonna like carve out this sort of space and highlight emerging BIPOC artists. So another person in Calgary actually is Karen Campos Castillo. They're a queer Latinx artist who it's now defunct, but they had this website called Heartbeats, and they would also highlight queer BIPOC artists and performers. And they featured myself on there, Vivek Shreya, Lido Pimienta. So like, and this is before a lot of these people like exploded, you know? So yeah, I just like look for it in other like outlets as well. It doesn't have to be stuck in the institution for like legitimacy. Like this is where, I don't know, community can fail you sometimes, but also I'd still will always insist on the importance of community and like self-articulation. So those are ways that I help combat the traps of identity politics and like the kind of channels or things that do work.
Thanks. And we're at 10:35, but I think we have time for one more question. So do you structure your art practice so writing and creating artwork inform and influence one another? And when you write, is it a conscious edited process, or do you try and kind of stay in the moment with a more spontaneous approach?
I definitely try and stay in the moment with writing. I like it's like I intuitively understand grammar, but like if you were to ask me, like I also don't get it at all. So this is why I trust friends of mine that are incredible editors, like Nehal, for example, to sometimes like be like, hey, does this make any sense at all? So yeah, again, that thing about knowing, my friend has, Esma has this expression like where she's like, know thyself. I know where my talents begin and end. I do think I have like a way of expressing myself through like words and writing that I do think has value. But like obviously not enough to necessarily ID as like a writer, capital W, but it's like writing and painting, and these are all tools under the artist umbrella. That's like an easier way for me to position myself, but they definitely absolutely inform one another. And I kind of I do approach it from an improvisatory or intuitive space because it just like is more liberating for me. And then I'll go in with my Virgo placements and like be very like critical of myself and go over things. But when I start, it's always from a more relaxed, free place. The same way, to be honest, as a child, I would have approached like writing a diary or a journal. Like I really start from that place, like free form, and like whatever stream of consciousness comes out, like that's kind of a place. And it used to be like, I'll do that in Word docs mostly, but sometimes for me also with memory and stuff, like handwriting stuff down helps. Like I used to, when I was in my undergrad, I would handwrite all my essays. Like even those 6, 7, 8-page essays, I would handwrite the writing out, and then I would type for my written notes, which probably meant I was taking way longer to write assignments than necessary. Now I just do it all on my computer, but for a time, like, handwriting things really was a very helpful, like, ritual or gesture for me, which I sometimes return to, but a lot of times I don't have the time. But it's always intuitive, and then I go back and, like, edit it later. But it's really important for me to allow myself that freedom.
Great. Thank you both so much for sharing your time and your practice with us, Jessica. I did want to just say one last thing as we're wrapping up. If you are an AU Arts student and you're interested in a studio visit with Jessica, we do have some spots available for Tuesday, which is tomorrow, and Thursday this week. So please email the gallery at ikg@auarts.ca as soon as you can, just with a short artist statement and 5 to 10 images of your work. Just to sign up for those. So those will be virtual kind of studio visits, and you'll have an opportunity to talk to Jessica more about her practice or about your own practice. And again, this talk has been recorded, so we'll have this available on stream and on our website as well. And in the Q&A section there, we've shared 2 of Jessica's SoundCloud links, so you can listen to those there as well. So thanks again, everyone. Thanks, Jessica. Thanks, Nehal.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much.